Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Concentrated feeding on pasture land can be a problem not only for regenerative agriculture, but land management in general. Joining us today to talk a little bit about that and to offer some solutions in that area is Lance Paskewitz of Hustler. Welcome, Lance. Thank you for joining us here today. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for having me on.
For those of you that are joining us online, we thank you for taking the time to tune in. If you have any questions, feel free to post those there in the chat area on the right of your screen. If you're joining us from social media, simply post your questions directly in those channels. So Lance, let's get started. I would love to know more about Hustler and what it is that you do there.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're really a family business that started back in 1961 on a small Pacific island called New Zealand. So there's a lot of products that we use today, such as Gallagher and other brands that are very, very well known that originated out of New Zealand. And a lot of it is really stemmed from their limitations on land. They only have so much land. There's two small islands poking out of the Pacific Ocean. And they've got to utilize that land the very best they can to get maximum production and highest return. And so that leads them to be actually quite an innovative bunch. And so back in 1961, Mr. Russell Curry, the founder of this family business, was in the ag industry, and he had some challenges on his place that he needed fixing. And so he started actually producing and building his own equipment. And then you sort of fast forward 60 plus years, and here we are today. I'm servicing the global market in the ag industry.
Very good. We hear a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture these days. It's kind of a big hot topic and something people are really paying attention to. Talk to us about some of the challenges that come with regenerative agriculture, because it sounds like Hustler's been involved in that kind of business segment for quite some time.
Yeah, we sure have. Yeah, thanks for that. And you know, in New Zealand in general, a lot of Americans, especially those that are really focused on regenerative ag, are actually looking to some of the practices that are practiced in New Zealand, because things like rotational grazing and things like mob grazing, different practices that are good for the soil and help with improving pasture production. A lot of that originated from New Zealand. So Hustler's really been focused on really supporting that whole regenerative movement, especially as related to livestock out on pasture, because that's really our number one asset is land. They're not making any more of it. So we've got to try and get that to a productivity level that we haven't had to before. And so we are a manufacturer of agriculture equipment, and probably across North America, we're best known for our hay handling and hay feeding equipment. And it's all sort of tied into really this feeding method that we like to call biocarpeting. And it's really a method that sort of mimics the natural grazing patterns of livestock. So if you sort of rewind back to the buffalo days, the Wild West days, where there was herds of buffalo ranging the western states, they moved in a way that was actually best for the land. It was high concentration for a short space of time, and then they would move on. And what happened was you would get all the good forages would be eaten. The leftover, less desirable forages like weeds or other things would be trampled. And then you'd have a decent concentration and even distribution of manure and urine and hoof traffic, and then they would keep moving. And so we're really building this equipment sort of centered around that type of method. That can be a challenge across North America when you've got a high concentration of livestock and not enough acres to keep them moving all the time. So this is a method where you're feeding stored feeds to try and keep mimicking that natural grazing pattern to improve the soil.
Very interesting. I didn't realize, but it makes total sense that New Zealand was such a model when it came to regenerative agriculture. And then you talk about the buffalo. So maybe you covered a little bit of this, but what kind of impact do things like soil compaction and manure concentration have on the land? Is it a positive thing? Is it something that you need to really be aware of? Fill us in on kind of how all that works.
I like how you worded the question, Sarah, because it can very much be positive if done correctly, or it can be very negative if done incorrectly. And let's take our example from what we know a lot of, which is you take the crop farmers, grain farmers. They are talking about soil compaction steadily. And one thing that can get overlooked in the livestock industry, because we just, we're not driving on the soil that much. But what about your livestock? I mean, you take a herd of 100 cows or 500 cows or 1,000 cows or 5,000 cows, that's a lot of weight. And there's some PSI on the ground somewhere. So you take the crop guys and they're changing out their tires. They're looking at, maybe going to tracks and reducing that compaction, because soil compaction is a very, very negative impact on the ability for it to grow. And mainly because of the sequestration and water flow through the soil. So it's important also to keep your herd scattered out so that you're not getting that high density traffic in one spot from a compaction standpoint. Now, from a manure standpoint, we also see people out there with manure spreaders spreading manure across fields. And that is for the obvious reason of fertilization. But what the question we really raised is, what if we could let the animals do that for us? It would reduce capital equipment, it would reduce fuel, it would reduce time. And so if you keep it distributed evenly, that's a high positive impact on the soil. On the flip side, if it's all concentrated in one spot, it's a very negative impact on the soil. And that's where the EPA gets very upset if there's a spillage of high concentration of manure for obvious reasons.
So what about the animals themselves? When we talk about, compacting them maybe closer or spreading them out, are there any impact, any kind of pros and cons to doing that?
Well, there is, and that poses a big challenge for a lot of the producers out there, especially those trying to work with livestock on pasture land, because sort of typical methods of feeding is you take the bale out there and you throw it in the hay ring, and then all your animals come up to the hay ring and eat from that. Some people have taken it to the next step further, and they say, okay, I can obviously see the massive mud holes, I can see the hay waste, I can see the compaction, so I'm going to unroll my bales. Now, that is a major step in the right direction, because you can unroll a bale just a certain length, and then it therefore scatters your livestock out a bit more. But it poses a big challenge, because you've got that many animals in one concentrated area, and they're standing there for quite a long time. So you've got two things. You've got a lot of just movement of a lot of animals in a very small area, which equals compaction, which then equals less grass production. And then you've also got a high concentration of manure, because while they're standing there for an hour or several hours, there's also a lot of manure being spread in that particular region. And an overconcentration of that is bad. In fact, if you do a little bit of Googling, I actually spoke to a professor down at the University of Arkansas, and they did soil samples around hay rings. And what they identified was that the actual soil samples out of there would grow nothing other than pigweeds. So that's a high impact. You don't want that spreading through your pastures.
Right. Yeah, that's not a good thing. What about cost? We always got to talk cost, right? What does it cost for producers to kind of navigate some of these issues and to maybe change up how they're doing things a little bit?
Yeah, that's good. This is a question that came up at the University of, Oklahoma State University. We were asked to come down there and sort of present this, what we call biocarpeting feeding method down there. And that was one of the questions that came up is, what's the cost? What's the return on investment? And return on investment obviously is the number one question for anything, because everything's got a cost to it, but what is the return? And so when you look at this sort of method of feeding, we actually manufacture a few different size machines for different size operations. And typically it's that sort of, if you're going to have like a 3-year break even or return on investment point on a piece of machinery, typically it would be, as low as 50 cows or 50 animals. And so, for example, that may even only be one bale a day. So we make these smaller machines that are feeding, that are just a single bale processor. And what it does is, instead of shredding and flailing and using high horsepower and big tractors and lots of fuel and lots of hours on tractors. You can power it with a very, very small tractor, which is obviously much more efficient on fuel and a lower cost from a capital investment standpoint. The machine itself is also a lower cost. Typically, you can get started for, I think actually right now around $10,000 for a machine that would take that hay. And it's like an automatic pitchfork. It just gently teases it so that you're not destroying all the nutritional quality of the hay, but yet it strings it out over a very long distance in a very long, tall, narrow windrow. So you reduce trampling, you scatter out the herd for better hoof traffic and manure management, and you also give everybody an equal chance to get to feed.
And you get less pigweed.
That's right.
So is this a technology that is just for ranchers, or are you guys seeing other applications for it as well?
Well, that's a good question. So we do work with a lot of beef operations, a lot of ranches across the country. However, we are seeing it in other industries. Like, for example, there's also backgrounding yards that would take calves in, and they would background them and prep them for either going out on grass or into the feedlot. And they really like these machines. The fact that they don't destroy the hay, they keep the nutritional quality and integrity of the hay there, and they keep the stem length long. It's one of the only machines, or probably the only machine I know of in the market, that can distribute that feed and maintain that stem length into bunks. So that's really, really helpful for bunk breaking calves when they're first coming in off of pasture. One thing they're familiar with is long stem grass. So next best thing is long stem hay in the bunk. So we're seeing a lot of starting yards use this type of equipment. It can be loader mounted, it can be tractor mounted. So there's quite a few different options there. But we also see it in grass dairies. So there's actually an increasing number of grass dairies across the U.S. and Canada, and we work with a number of them that they're really running their dairy cattle out on grass, actually very similar to how they do it in New Zealand. And then they bring them in once a day or twice a day for milking, and then turn them back out on a new pasture. And when it comes to the point where forage growth is not enough to sustain the herd, they obviously have to supplement. And they'll use these in these regenerative grass dairies to sort of manage that hoof traffic and be able to feed hay without negatively impacting their soil.
Very interesting. So if any key points or key takeaways here to leave our audience with today, what do you want them to walk away with?
Well, I think probably the biggest impression I'd like to leave with the audience is that when we think of regenerative ag, we sometimes could have that sentiment like, ooh, that seems like a massive project. And it seems like I'll have to spend a bunch of money. And it seems like it's for the really smart guys that just know what they're doing, and maybe I'm not that guy. It's actually very, very simple, very cost effective, and the return on investment is great. So, and this is speaking, including, yes, our equipment and our methods, but even other practices like rotational grazing and cross fencing and things like that. There's actually some very creative ways that you can do it at very low cost. And in a lot of cases, the NRCS and other operations like that organizations will come in and actually support and subsidize some of those practices. So just number one impression is just give it a try and give it a start. Even if it's starting small, we always learn to crawl before we walk and then run.
Yeah, get in there and check it out and see what you can learn about it. And maybe it has application for your operation. So Lance, thank you so much for your insight here today and for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate that.
Thank you all for joining us as well. We know you have busy schedules, so we appreciate getting a little bit of your time here. A reminder, all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.